Good morning, grade 10s. We're going to do the exponential graph. Let's sketch then y equals b to the x. So now your x is in the exponent. That's why we say exponential graphs or exponential functions. Let's use once again the table. If I substitute the negative 2 into the place of x, 2 to the negative 2 will be 1 over 4. If I substitute the negative 1, 2 to the negative 1 is then a half. 2 to the 0, any base to the 0 will be 1. And then you say 2 to the 1 is then 2. 2 squared is equal to 4. Now let's plot the points then. So it's negative 2 goes to a quarter. So negative 2 and a quarter. Negative 1 goes to a half. So we just plot the points there. 0 will be 1, and remember to write your coordinates there. 1 will go up to 2. You can see it's increasing there, so it's 1 and 2, and 2 goes up to 4. So it's 2 and 4. And then you'll notice there will be no x-intercept, so that means it's asymptote. And then you can just join the dots because that's a curve, and you put your arrows there. So this one then is your f of x is equal to 2 to the x. So this is the shape of an exponential function. If you look at another base, if the base is bigger than 1, so let's have a look, 3. So again you take the negative 2, you plug it into the x, so that's giving you 3 to the negative 2, so it's 1 over 9. Then it's 3 to the negative 1, it's a third. 3 to the 0 will be 1. 3 to the 1 is then 3, so you use the base and you just plug in your x values into the place of x. So let's have a look at that one then. So it's 3 to the x. So now negative 2 will result in a ninth. Negative 1 is then a third. 0 will still be 2. 0 will still be 1. Then the 1 will now be a 3. And the 2 will be a 9. So what happened to this one is getting closer to your x-axis, no x-intercept, passing through the 1, passing through that dot, passing through that. So this one is then y is equal to 3 to the x. Can you see if you compare the two, it's starting lower, intersect on the same place on the y-axis, and then start to increase rapidly. If you look at this one here, we say this is an increasing function because if the x is getting bigger, the y is also getting bigger. So this is increasing. Start from a lower value, goes up to higher values. If you look at that one, now my base is a half. It's less than 1, but it's still positive. It's a proper fraction. So if I take my negative 2, and I plug it into the place of x, so a half to the negative 2 is giving me 4. A half to the negative 1 is giving me 2. Any base to the 0 will be 1. And then you carry on. So if you look at that, let's plot the points there. So now if you look at that one, then we say negative 2 will giving you then 4. So go up to 4. So negative 2 and 4. Negative 1 will result in a 2. So negative 1 and 2. 0 is also the 1 there. And then 1 is giving me a half. So it's 1 and a half. And 2 is giving you a quarter. Can you see? Now we're starting from the top there. And it forms a curve going down closer and closer to the x-axis. But it's not intersecting the x-axis. So that is the asymptote. And now, because we're starting from the top there, we say that's a decreasing function. a decreasing function. Okay, so in the next question then they say, what will be my asymptote? So it never reaches your x-axis there, so it will be y equals 0. That's my asymptote. With this exponential, we only got one asymptote. Domain will be my x values. And if I look at that, my x values I'm using there. If I look at my x values, you're using negative infinity, positive infinity, no exclusions. Or you can say x element of real numbers. The range, if you look at the y, you only use the y values above your asymptote. So we say then y is greater than 0. You can't put equal because that's your asymptote. So that's the range. Right, so this is your basic exponential graph. If we look at this one, this is your second page of your worksheet. Now we're going to put an a width in front of your bx, your base with your exponent. We put a, so it's a times b to the x. So that is just my basic graph. Once again, you just take the -2 and you plug it into the x. So that will give you a quarter, that will give you a half, anything to the 0 is 1, and that's your basic graph. What will happen now? See, that's a 2, and the dot means times. Now I must times that graph by 2. So I take that answer, a quarter, and I times it by 2, and I'm getting a half. I take my previous answer, times it by 2, get a half. Take the 1, times by 2, giving you 2. Take the 2, times by the 2, it's giving me 4. And then you take the 4, and you times it by 2, it's giving you 8. Okay. If it's a half, what will you do? Can you see that's my basic graph, 2 to the x. So I go back to 2 to the x, it's a quarter, and I times it by a half. So a half times a quarter, it's 1 over 8. Go back to the original one, 2 to the x. You take the value and you times it by half. So that's a half times a half, it's a quarter. Times by that one, times by a half. Take the 2 times by a half. Take the 4 times by a half. What's happened with this one here? It's not that it's -2. That actually means -1 times 2 to the x. So now what will happen? I go back to my basic 2 to the x, and I just times by -1. Go back to my basic x, and I times by -1. Take my basic x, and you just times by -1. Okay, let's plot these points according to the table. So it's easy to use the table there. You'll see that the asymptote will still be the y-axis, the x-axis thing. Okay, so the first one, it's -2. -2 goes to a quarter. Right? -1 goes to a half. 0 will be 1. And 1 will be 2. And 2 will be 4. But remember to write down your coordinates as well. So that's my basic graph. And that is y equals 2 to the x. My second graph, we multiply that by 2. So that means my -2 will now be a half. My -1 will be a 1 because I times by 2. My 1 will be a 2. My answer here for 1 was supposed to be a 2, but now it goes up to 4. And the 2 was supposed to be 4, but now I go up to 8. So I start lower there, and I go through that. That's if I multiply it by 2. So my graph then is then 2 times 2 to the x. Just remember, if you do this on your calculator, don't put the dot. You must put the times. You will say 2 times 2 to the power of, let's say, 2. Okay. Don't put the dot because the dot means a decimal. So if you use your calculator, don't use the dot there. you put your multiplication sign. Right, so let's have a look at the third one. Now I must times by half. So it means then my negative 2, that's according to your table now. Negative 2 will go to 1 over 8. Negative 1 will be a quarter. 0 will be a half. 1 will be 1. And 2 will be 2. So can you see it's a little bit lower than that? So that means a half times 2 to the x. See, already you can compare the graphs. If it's just 2 to the x, if it's a 1, and then it double up, it's getting more steeper. If it's a half, it's going lower than your basic graph. But still, no x-intercept. No x-intercept, so that will be your asymptote. Okay, what will a negative do to the graph? What will a negative do to the graph? So that one, let's plot that one there. So if you look at that, you can see now the following. So now, still using your table, negative 2, it's negative a quarter. Negative 1, it's negative a half. 0 is giving me 1, negative 1. 1 is giving me negative 2. And 2 is giving me negative 4. So what's happened to the graph there? Can you see it's reflected about the x-axis? So if there's a negative in front of your graph, it's a reflection into the x-axis there. Okay, so that is if you plot those points there. Okay, then the third worksheet, we said then, let's have a look at this one. And now we're going to do the following one. So now we're going to say, okay, now we've put the a in front. We've got the b to the x already. Now we're going to add the q value. As the previous graphs, the q value will be vertical translation. So once again, you take your standard or your basic graph, 3 to the x. You take the negative 2 and you plug it in. So 3 to the negative 2, it's 1 over 9. Then you go with a negative 1, then you go with a 0. Then you take the basic graph there, can you see the answer of the previous line, and you add 1. So it's 1 over 9 plus 1. A third plus the 1. 1 plus 1 is giving you 2. 3 plus 1 is giving you 4. If you go to this next option there, it's your basic graph shifting 3 down. So you take your basic graph 1 over 9 and you minus 3. Take the basic graph, you minus 3. Take the basic graph and you minus 2. You can also do this on your calculator. So that means then you've got 3 to the power of x. Now into the place of x, I'm going to substitute the negative 2. Right, then you must go down, then you say negative 3, and then you put equals, and then you press your decimal. So it's 2,8 or 2,9 rounded off. If I want to go to the next one there, all you do now on the calculator is you go back and you delete your x value. Delete the x value, substitute now your 1, negative 1, put equal, and then you get negative 2,7 or 2,6. Then you go 0. So you go back, delete your x value there, and the negative, because 0 is just 0. You put equal, and then you get negative 2. Okay, and so you can carry on if you want to use the calculator. Okay, but let's have a look at that. Let's plot the points. So the first one is negative 2, and a third. 1 over 9. Negative 1 is then a third. 0 is then 1. And 1 is then the 3. And the 2 is the 9. So remember also to write this down. So that's your basic one. That's 3 to the y is equal to 3 to the x. Once again, you can see your asymptote will be y equals 0. So that's the first one. So you've got your asymptote, y equals 0. Right. The next one we're going to do is then now we're going to shift that one up. So now if we shift it one up, now you'll see the q value there was 0. Now my q value is 1. So now before I do my graph, I'm going to do the asymptote there. So first asymptote you indicate with the dotted line. So that's my asymptote, and that will be y equals 1, which is then the q value. The previous one was just the x-axis, so that was because the q was a 0, so that was my asymptote. So that means not allowed to touch that line. So now if you've got -2, it's -1 and a 9th. And then -1, it's -1 and a third, or +1 and a third. 0 will now be 2. 1 will go up to 4. And 2 will go up to 10. Okay, so that's it. So now the whole graph is shifting 1 up because of my q value. Right, so that's that one there. If I look now at the third option there, so that's 3 to the x minus the 3. So that means your graph will shift 3 down. So what will I do? My q value is -3. So you start there with the asymptote. Asymptote will be the q value. So you start with your dotted line. So that is then y equals -3. So that's my dotted line. Now, this is the asymptote. So now, according to my table, -2 will be -2,9. -1 will be -2,6. 0 will be -2. 1 will be -1. 2 will be going up to 6. Okay, so that means then this is your graph. So remember to write your coordinates as well. So that's the shifting of your graphs up and down. So once again, the q value is then indicating your shifting there. Okay, just to summarize the exponential graph then, if you look at your exponential graph, the general form is then a b to the x plus q. So why is it exponential? Because the variable x is in the exponent. The a, like the previous graphs, indicating the shape. So if the a is a positive number, your graph will be above your asymptote. If the a value will be negative, that's where you get your reflection. Then it will be below the asymptote. The b will always be positive, that's the base. If the b was then greater than 1, we start lower point and it's getting bigger, so we say it's an increasing function. So the bigger the x will be, the bigger the y will be. Increasing function. If your b, the base value, it's less than 1, greater than 0, that means a proper fraction. It will be a decreasing function. It means it's starting from the top values and it's going down. So what will happen decreasing? If the x is getting bigger, the y value is getting smaller. That's decreasing function. If you look at the influence or the effect of q, q is your vertical translation. So that's the constant right at the end. Right at the end, that's the constant there. So if it's a positive value, the graph is shifting upwards. If it's a negative value, the graph is shifting downwards. That also indicates the horizontal asymptote. And the asymptote will be dotted line, and it will be y equals the q value. If there's no q value, it means y equals 0. Then you can still work out the x-intercept. That means you put y equals to 0. Then you use your knowledge of exponents. So the y is equal to 0. You shift your constant over, and then you get 2 to the x. Make the bases the same. and then you get your x-intercept. Y-intercept, you make x equal to 0. So you make the x equal to 0. 2 to the 0 is then 1. 1 minus 1, giving you the x-intercept. Okay. Good luck with the exponential graphs.